I'm pleased to introduce William Desmond for our final keynote speech. So Professor William Desmond is Kashishi Yakum Fellow at the Augustinian Institute, Villanova University, and Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at the Institute of Philosophy, KU Leuven. He has held the David Cook Chair in Philosophy at Villanova University and the Thomas A. F. Kelly Visiting Professor at Maynooth University, Ireland. His philosophical vocation has its roots in a religious upbringing, endowing a sensibility for the mysterious and the poetic. And after a very brief stint with engineering, Professor Desmond studied literature and philosophy at Cork before moving to Penn State for his doctoral studies. Among his works include the celebrated trilogy Being and the Between, Ethics and the Between, and God and the Between. His more recent works include The Intimate Universal, The Gift of Beauty and the Passion of Being, The Voiding of Being, and Godsend. Readers will find a living voice in Desmond's work, whose richness and depth continues to generate 1,000 allusions to important trajectories. There is no terminus to this hermeneutic labour. And although this lack of terminus might initially suggest a postmodern fetishization of indeterminate and differential openness, which engenders endless violence, betrayal, and subversion, the horizon actually offered is in fact a soul-leading labour of love which draws us into discipleship. A faithful encounter with Desmond will make the effort to hold openness and multiplicity in a charitable and peaceful relation to ultimacy and unity. This is rooted in Desmond's commitment to being suspended within the tension of the between. The between refuses hard dichotomies, which posits that things and thoughts need to be either an identitarian universality which colonizes or a differential particularity which always subverts. Desmond offers a paradoxical approach where on the one hand we hold vigil for the descent of the universal which intimately and charitably dwells within and between particulars, and on the other hand particulars enter into charitable relations with other particulars, making half gestures to and delivering us over to something universal. This art of making porous and entangled distinctions calls us into another kind of normal which pays attention to the plural ways of tuning into the gift of being, generating epiphanies which return us to the generosity of an originating, effusive power. Please join me in welcoming Professor William Desmond for his talk, Measure Beyond Measuring, on the Disproportion of Divine Mystery.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and thank all of you for the very fine presentations that I haven't been to all of them, but to most of them. Really extremely impressive range, as well as thoughtful depth in your contributions. I come at the end I come at the end, and we're all tired, I know, at this particular point. But what I'll do is I'll just read a page or two at the beginning, just to get me going, and then there were a number of themes that I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at the notion of measure and exceeding measure. I'm just looking at my note here. Measure and mystery, what that might mean, and then the notion of mystery and being true to mystery, what that might mean. And then something about disproportion. And finally, if I have some time, perhaps I might say something about analogy and dialectic and metaxology in relation to the question of measure and disproportion. But just let me read a little bit at the start, and I know that Protagoras has been cited on a number of occasions today and yesterday. And of course, we think of the phrase, man is the measure of all things, as initiating a kind of humanism, so to say. And there are different humanisms. But we usually use the abbreviated formulation, man is the measure of all things. But in the fuller formulation, it is, man is the measure of all things, of the things that are insofar as they are, of the things that are not insofar as they are not. And the latter part of the citation is not always quoted, but I think it's actually very significant. But being the measure of things that are not, this is, I think, of insignificance. being the measure of things that are not has a significance in our time that perhaps was not previously dreamt of. The measure of the things that are is related to the measure of the things that are not, taken in the sense of not now in being, but perhaps capable of being brought into being. The things to be, though not now. I take the transhuman impulse to be oriented to the second. So there's that sense of the transhuman, which has a certain equivocity built into it, which I just briefly mentioned. Something may not now be, but humans, on the basis of taking the measure of what now is, will be the measure of what is to be. I'm translating a sense from the quotation. The sense of our being the measure is not confined to what we can determine of what already is as determinate, but of what is to be determined yet, of what we will determine to be. Hence the striking future orientation built into this formulation, which I take to be a mark of modernity and indeed post-modernity as an historical epoch. What begins as a dream to be the masters and possessors of nature turns into a project to be not only the determining measure of what is, but the self-determining measure of what is to be. A project is a dream turned to the future, mediated by means of power attained over what is past as already determined, and over what is now as the more or less fluid determining field of what is yet to be more fully determined. Overall, I would say that we find the massive objectification of nature as other, coupled with the huge subjectification of the human being. This is often expressed as the duality, even dualism of subject and object. But I suggest it is subtended by the subject as the projecting power, the power whose project is the objectification of nature, and not in simple opposition to itself, but as serving itself. Itself as subject now, not only the measure of determinate objectivity, but of self-determining subjectivity. In such a project, one can see the lineaments of a totalizing orientation to what was, what is, and what is to be. Many commentators have noticed this about modernity, but less noted or foregrounded is that we claim to be measure qua measuring, and hence as dynamic, we affect the determination of things, but with the sometimes half-hidden project of complete self-determination. So again, in a simple reading of the Protagorean statement, we're the measure of things that are other to us, but I think nested in it, in fact, is a project of self-determination in which when we make ourselves the measure of things that are other to us, we're actually serving ourselves and our own more and more complete self-determination. By determining the indeterminate, we impose measure and thereby show ourselves to be self-determining in and through the determination of what is other to ourselves. Measure and beyond measure. The human being may seek to be the measure of finite things, but is the human the measure of itself? That's a central question for me. Even if one is to grant that there's something about the human being that is the measure of things, it's, I think, a far more perplexing not KNOT as to whether we're the measure of ourselves. Is the human being the measure that is beyond measure? And I think this is again a very important question. Is there something about our very being that itself can't be measured? And if there is such a beyond in the immanences of what it means to be a human being, does that immanent beyond allow of different deployments along different axes of perhaps self-appropriation, but perhaps also openness to something more than ourselves? Suppose there is something about us that is determining rather than determinate, something exceeding determination, perhaps either indeterminate or overdeterminate. Now, these are terms that I will kind of come back to again and again. The difference between the indeterminate and the overdeterminate. The indeterminate as lacking determination, the overdeterminate as a fullness of excess, in excess of determination. And then there's the determinate and the self-determining. That's a kind of quadruplicity that allows a lot of thought. A measure asks a certain determinacy to help make determinate what otherwise appears as more or less indeterminate. And again, one could stop and reflect upon. I was thinking of, in my heyday, I was a marathon runner, but one of the crucial acts in staging a marathon is that you measure the course accurately. Now again, there may be runners here, but if a runner runs a marathon and they discover that the course is short, even if it's only 200 meters, they really get very pissed off. They want an exact measure. They want to run 26 miles, 384 yards in the British way of measuring. And I think that there's something to be dwelt on there, the connection between measure and determinacy. If the measure was indeterminate, what would an indeterminate measure be? I would say the dominant sense of measuring is imposing determinacy on indeterminacy. If you had an indeterminate measure, for instance, that infected our cybernetic systems, they would just go haywire. They're absolutely dependent upon a precision that is such and nothing but such. It's not more or less. In ordinary life, we can satisfy ourselves with more or less. It's, if you're a cook, and the recipe says, put in a pinch of salt. What's a pinch of salt? How do you measure a pinch of salt? There's probably somebody inventing a tool now to sell on YouTube, which is the standard of a pinch. Well, a pinch is more or less, and some people will sprinkle loads of salt and so on. You've eaten those kind of dishes. But in the sense of a truer measure from, let's say, not merely a scientific, but a scientistic, even cybernetic orientation, precision, exactitude is of the utmost importance. And our lives are more and more shaped by univocal precision in that sense, insofar as they're built into the cybernetic machines that shape so much of our lives now. Suppose there is something about us that is determining rather than determinate. If there's something about us that's determining, you're already moving out of a space of determinacy and nothing but determinacy. There's an openness. How do you measure openness? What would an open measure be? These are the kind of questions come up in relation to Cusa earlier today. If we are the measuring itself isn't just a measure. There's a dynamic activity of discernment and judgment that goes into the act of measuring. That really can't be pinned down in the exactitudes of determinacies. What kind of measure could the latter be at all? And again, I'm at this point particularly making reference to the human being as the measuring rather than just the measure. Suppose that the human being was the measure of all things other in finite creation, one must still ask if the human being is the measure of himself or herself. Is there something about being human being that exceeds measure, evident in our efforts and claims to be the measure of all things? So our claim to be the measure of all things boomerangs back on itself when one begins to reflect on what it means to be a measure. Because there's something about being a measure that itself can't be measured. Certainly not in the same way as when we apply it to things other than ourselves. Is there not a question for us in the fact that something exceeding measure emerges with the human being claiming to be the measure? I find it interesting that Dante makes use of the word transhumanar in the Commedia. So the notion of the transhuman is not confined to the spaces of cybernetic dreaming in our own time. The more than human is not out of consideration in an ethos of being that contemplates a certain divinization of the human being, and this not in a sense which becomes more widespread in the atheisms of the 19th century. The trans can point in different directions. It can point out, it can point in, it can point up, it can point down. And one can traverse this crossing of the in-out, up-down with different intents, some entirely opposed to each other. One might want to be God, but by hating God. One might want to become more divine by loving the divine. One might prefer to reverse the ascent to the sun and more than return to the underground, but rather burrow into the deeper darkness under the underground. Transhumanizing. You shall become as gods. Are there projects seeking to prove the serpent true? Would this be in the projection to produce counterfeit doubles of the divine? So I'll read a little bit more and then I'll... So there is a threshold concerning measure in which transcendence in diverse senses is at stake. And I distinguish, Professor Van Erp yesterday expressed his hesitation about the concept of transcendence. This is an area in which there has to be friendly, companioning disagreement about his lack of understanding of what's really at stake. I say this in a companioning sense, so I forgive him if he will forgive me. So transcending towards nature as other, first sense. Self-transcending, the second sense, self-transcending towards a projected higher form of ourselves. And the third sense, transcendence towards what is more than either the exterior transcendence of things as other or the self-surpassing being of our own immanent selving. With due qualifications, these correspond to three senses of transcendence I've had recourse to when thinking about things in God in the Between. If I'm not mistaken, this third transcendence has been made problematic in modernity both by a univocalizing objectification of the first sense of transcendence and nature as other, and by developments of second transcendence, our own self-transcending, especially when we take this to define itself in terms of its own subjectivized autonomy. A logic of determination governs the first, a logic of self-determination governs the second. I'm interested especially in how a logic of self-determination insinuates itself into all our thinking, including our thinking of what is other through our self-determination. I would say this applies to the first sense of transcendence. Objectively, we determine nature as other as univocally as possible, but subjectively, this is with the aim of making it serve our own self-determination. The status of third transcendence, which in the traditional theological language is, of course, the transcendence of God, inevitably becomes endowed with an equivocal position. So there's more that could be said about this. I think that there is actually an antinomy between autonomy and transcendence that has to be faced. If we absolutize autonomy, we tend to relativize transcendence as other to us. But if there's a transcendence as other, such as divine transcendence, then autonomy has to be relativized. And generally speaking, I think the unfolding of modernity has to choose the first option. That is to say, more and more absolutize self-determination or autonomy, meaning to the relativization in a variety of different ways of what is other to us, whether it's the otherness of nature or whether it's the otherness of the divine. As autonomy waxes, transcendence wanes. This ideal of autonomy emphasizes our self-determining power even when our relatedness to others is granted. The primary stress is still on our self-determining. So this is where that question about, even if one absolutizes the ideal of self-determination, the question of measure comes back into the picture again, because are we in fact a measure of ourselves? Just a slight diversion here. Kant is the great philosopher of autonomy, and his ethical project begins by the exclusion of God as allowing any grounding of our moral being. He brings back God later into the picture in order to, if you like, complete what is implied by our human condition. But I find it very striking that in his later years he took up the question of evil, radical evil. And it's extraordinary to think of the Pope, so to say, of moral autonomy having to acknowledge that the will that is supposed to will itself, determine itself fully, discovers that it can't will itself. It can't will the good. There's a kind of internal kink in the kind of transcendental machinery of the moral subject, and actually even an inversion where the moral being actually follows its impulses rather than the clear commands of the moral law. Kant himself was excoriated by many of his contemporaries, for enlightened contemporaries, even including Goethe. He used the image of having, he has stained the cloak of the philosopher by, the fear was this, that he was bringing back into the picture something like original sin. And that bringing back original sin was the original sin, so to say, for enlightened philosophers who took Kant as leading them out of the obscurantism of religious transcendence. But that whole question, even in the very context of absolutizing autonomy, where the will can't will itself, the will that is supposed to enable itself finds itself disabled, and disabled in and through itself alone. So that raises the question to what extent we really are the measure of ourselves. It raises the question, even if, for instance, we can make claim to be the measure of everything other than ourselves in nature, because clearly that project has been fulfilled in some degree in modernity, but the one who is the projector and completing the project is caught in a certain, it's not even an aporia. I have to use the word kink, in the sense that it's something that, it's an inward otherness that cuts under the power of the will to will itself. And strangely enough, the will itself, as willing itself, is in some sense implicated in the fact that it ends up not being able to will itself. So you have very paradoxical consequences if you pursue that line of thinking. Okay, now just the notion of mystery and measure, and I'll just come back again to the notion of determinability and just talk a little bit about the sense of what it means to know that is bound up with determinability. As you know yourself, the geometrical measure was mentioned more than once in previous times, but one way to think about what's at stake with mystery is something like the following. Philosophers generally have tended to look on mystery as a kind of cop-out, basically. It's a nullity from the point of view of epistemic claims. That if you're a philosopher, for instance, and you want to make a claim that there's a mystery here that can't be fully comprehended, it's often seen that this is actually a reneging on the very project of trying to understand. So this is perhaps most accentuated within rationalistic ways of understanding things. It's certainly very much present in positivistic orientations that, again, will claim that exactitude in a determinable and measurable way is very much at the center of what it means to know. I think there's kind of an ambiguity here that is worth bearing in mind, and I'll just make reference to the famous statement in Aristotle about each of us desires to know. All human beings desire to know, and again, there's nothing controversial about that particular claim. It's a reiteration of what we find in Plato in the Theaetetus, where he talks about wonder as the pathos. This is the word, the pathos of the philosopher. But my point is this, that wonder is often understood as curiosity, But curiosity is itself understood in terms of determinability. If you wonder about something, this is the picture, you might be open in a quasi-global way to something that shows itself to you. But if you're in pursuit of knowledge, you have to move from that global openness, that indeterminacy of wonder, to the determinacies of curiosity, where you begin to ask, is it this, what is it, and so on. You become more specific, you become more determinate. And the unfolding of the teleology of knowledge is with respect to a transition from the indeterminate to the more and more determinate. The example that actually Aristotle uses in the Metaphysics is the notion of something like a geometrical puzzle. That you may start out with a puzzle, so there's a certain sense of wonder in it, but as you make your curiosity more and more determinate, you respond to the puzzle, and if you're successful in carrying through the teleological unfolding of knowing, you come up with a solution. And when you come up with a solution, you have a determinate answer to a question that has become itself more and more determinate. And once you come up with the determinate answer, the puzzle vanishes. It's no longer a puzzle. So you see a kind of teleology, in a certain understanding of curiosity that goes to the end of the unfolding, but it's essentially driven to the dissolution of any sense of the mysterious. That to attain knowledge is to dissolve the sense of the mysterious. No, I think that is actually a very, it's very widespread understanding of the teleology of knowing. An example that some of you might follow up on if you read Lonergan's Insight, for instance. He talks about the pure desire to know. And when you dwell more closely with it, it's very much driven towards the dissolution, at least certainly within the scientific sphere, of the initial puzzle, and moving on then to a new puzzle that may be generated by new questions and new curiosities and so on. I think that a teleology of knowing has to be completed by an archaeology of knowing. And I think the sense of wonder has more than just the modality of curiosity as part of it. And I distinguish between astonishment and perplexity and curiosity. That there's an originating astonishment that isn't a matter of a determinate curiosity. That when we seek to know, we're first opened before we open ourselves. And in those moments of astonishment, that opening happens to us. There's an event character to the opening of our desire to know. The desire to know is subtended by certain conditions that make desire itself possible. Desire doesn't create itself as if out of nothing. Desire isn't self-determining. Desire is, in its initial phase, is not determinate at all. But it's not merely indeterminate. There's a certain fullness of endowment in the power to seek that isn't just a determinate object that is sought. I think the experience of astonishment, again, as I've tried to give expression to that, is more over-determinate than indeterminate. There's a too muchness that wakes us up, so to say. I sometimes use the example of beholding. When we think of beholding, we sometimes think, I behold something, and we think there's an intentional vector that goes from us to the things. Behold the Lamb of God, and we look. But I think there's what I would call a beholding from. We're already opened in a beholding by something that enters into us, and it's not that we behold something, but we are beheld by something, so to say, that already awakens that power of going towards it. There's as I call it, a porosity of being that is presupposed by the very desire to know itself, but isn't just simply the desire to know. And there's a passio ascendi, there's a patience of being that subtends our more dynamic, intentional orientation to objects. So curiosity is a late development in that more determinate sense. Now, why I dwell on that is because I think that sense of astonishment, wonder as astonishment, is very much bound up with the sense of mystery also. It's not, again, just mystery at the outset that is dispelled once we go through the process and end up with the answer that dispels the mystery. There's a sense of mystery in the very initiation of the search for determinate knowledge itself. So our desire emerges out of something deeply mysterious. It's certainly not self-generating. Once having emerged, it can take on certain characteristics of self-determination. We can direct our attention in this way or that way, but we're opened before we open ourselves in this way or that way. And before, over a long process of time, we become more self-determining. We shape what we become. But that's on the basis of endowed powers that are not themselves self-endowed on our part. So that's part of the significance of asking the question, as if we are the measure of all things other to us, that extroverted transcending that we're capable of in relation to things, it so takes over that we forget actually the enabling conditions that allow us to be open in the first instance. We're in flight from mystery, and it's a flight that forgets, in fact, the enabling conditions that allows it even to be in flight. So there's a sense of enigma in the beginning, and I think I would argue also there's an enigma even when we have seemingly surveyed the field of all determinate knowledge. Again, I think that is one of the kind of desiderata of the more positivistic orientation. We don't understand now, but we will understand because we have the scientific instruments that will allow us by incremental steps to attain a complete knowledge of all the determinacies that lie around us or lie before us. In fact, I think that's false because it's based upon an ontology that thinks that what is simply a set of determinations. And if that's your ontology, you can't even make sense of the fact that you're seeking to know the determinate, because the very seeking itself is not a determinacy. It's a determining. It might even become a self-determining, but there's something about it. There's something about the measuring that in using a measure is not itself measure. Measuring as an activity, whether of judgment or discerning or epikeia, there are many forms of measuring, but quite dynamic activity, they aren't simply exhausted by determinate. Or I'm not even sure what a self-determining measure could be on its own terms alone. That to have a measure in self-determining seems already to be porous to something that exceeds self-determination. So I would correlate curiosity with determinacies, and again, part of our project, it seems, in modernity is to the totalization of determinacies. Univocalize the world as much as possible. Univocalize even the human beings now in some of the technologies that we have. Homogenize human beings themselves as items of serviceable disposability. And yet the very project that is proposed to us doesn't fit into the project itself. The projectors and we as projectors are in a different dimension, precisely to be authors of such a project. One of the areas which I think that I talk about curiosity and astonishment, I think the notion of perplexity is a third modality of wonder that has to be taken into account. And both astonishment and perplexity are closer to the threshold of religious porosity than curiosity. I think it's very significant that in earlier epochs, curiosity was seen in the light of a sometimes irreverent intrusion into reality. That for instance, in that old notion of the custodium or the cupiscentio oculorum, the concupiscence of the eyes. We can look on things in order to know things, but not out of love, but out of the desire to intrude into their mystery and take possession of that mystery, take it to ourselves. you can see actually how this has erotic connotations also in relation to dealing with the other as an object of possession rather than someone as other who is a companioning beloved. But perplexity is very interesting because perplexity keeps reappearing, but it doesn't always reappear as a provisional form of curiosity that then will be conquered. There are perplexities in the human condition. I'll just simply mention the way tragedy, for instance, brings home to us perplexities that raise questions in a hyperbolic dimension. They're not determinate questions. When someone, for instance, who we love dies, there's a question, but it's not answered by a determinate answer. It's a question that eats into it so eats into the soul that the soul can no longer rest in its grief. There's a dimension to it that exceeds all determination, and it also exceeds self-determination. And it's not merely indeterminate. There are perplexities that resist measure. Again, that's why I mentioned tragedy, for instance. The classic view of tragedy is that the measure is exceeded by the hero, and because of that excess, Nemesis, or the gods, strike back, and the hero is brought back to the human measure from the transhuman domain. But I don't think we have to simply even speak of it in the kind of liturgical sense of a tragic play, because there are sufferings in the human condition that are so perplexing that they induce a kind of restlessness that isn't the happy restlessness that is simply in search of the good. It's a restlessness that can't sleep in relation to certain questions that keep haunting one, breaking into one's finite peace, certainly. Is there a peace beyond finitude? This is a question that gets raised here. So, despite the ambitions of the transhumanists, these perplexities will return again and again. Now, again, I don't think one should paint a merely dark picture on that particular score, but often human beings are the kinds of creatures that will not stop in their tracks sometimes unless they're hit by an otherness that takes the wind out of their sails. So we seem to be the kind of animals that have to go to the extreme in order to say to ourselves, well, perhaps that wasn't quite the direction that we should have been going, in this kind of absolutizing way that we sometimes do. And then we start again. But when we start again, we have to call upon the powers of astonishment. We have to pass through perplexities. And our curiosity will have to be disciplined in manners that are appropriate to our own condition and the conditions of being that are presented to us in nature and beyond. So what I'm talking about there in relation to perplexity, again, is something beyond measure. And it's an interesting question to ask ourselves whether the conditions of life in Western modernity are in the business not only of turning astonishment into this voracious curiosity, but of evading perplexities that don't fit into the, I call it the dominion of serviceable disposability, that things are to serve us, and once they have served us, they're disposable, and they are disposed. So that self-referential logic that we find in self-determination is also it's nested at the center of an instrumentalizing of all being. I mean, this is one of the interesting things, because often a moral autonomy is counterposed to instrumentalizing being, but the logic is a self-mediating logic in and through the use of what is other in the case of the instrumental or the serviceable, but in the case even of self-determination, it's not clear that we have actually escaped from that self-circling that in the old way of thinking, the old Augustinian way of thinking, is the curvato sensae that he essentially sees as at the heart of or turn. Okay, let me just keep an eye on the time here. Then we come to the issue of disproportion. And I could say something about the three senses of transcendence that I mentioned at the beginning, the transcendence of nature as other, our own self-transcending, and the sense of the disproportion of God. But it might be worthwhile just returning to the question of measure and perspective. And I'll start with a more humorous one. Jonathan Swift. We all know his voyage to Lilliput. We don't often pay as much attention to his voyage to Brobdingnag. We pay lesser attention to his voyage to Laputa, and probably least of all to the island where the Houyhnhnms are. But Swift was a genius, but if we just stick with the little people and the very big people, my point is this: size matters in relation to measure. If you're in the land of the Lilliputians, then Gulliver is a giant. He exceeds their measure. And of course, there are very satirical passages in the voyage to Laputa, or not in Lilliput, where you have this 7-inch human being lecturing the master of the universe, the divinity. Whereas in Brobdingnag, you have these outside human beings, and Gulliver is 7 inches, so to say. The Brobdingnagians are more gentle, actually, than the little Lilliputians. The little Lilliputians are mean-spirited warriors fighting each other about which end of the egg should be opened. The big enders and the small enders, they go to war about those very significant questions. But the Brobdingnagians, the outside people, are very gross also. Gulliver sees their pores are so huge, he's disgusted by their bigness. But the Brobdingnag, there is a scene when he's in that land where he praises the conquering colonialism of the European powers, particularly Britain. And the Brobdingnagians are they're absolutely appalled at the violence that is entailed in Imperium. But the point would be this: if size matters, what is measure? What is measure in the land of the Lilliputians is going to be quite different from what is measurable in the land of the Brobdingnagians. So there's a relativity built into what we take to be measurable. And I think it's very relevant, actually, to the difference between the micro and the macro. This is an issue that, again, I'll just mention in passing, that a lot of discussions connected with nature that are tied to scientific pictures of things often really don't do justice to the macro experience that we have as creatures on the surface of the earth. It's often taken to be the case that as we experience things at the ordinary macro level, the truth of things is elsewhere at a reductive micro level. And the reason why I think Swift raises the question of measure from the point of view of perspectivalism is, how do we choose between one and the other? And again, Swift does it with, I think, great comic effect. But a strange twin to Jonathan Swift would be Blaise Pascal. I don't think people often put Blaise Pascal and Jonathan Swift in the same room. But Pascal has marvelous reflections about the big and the small. What is proportionate to us and what is disproportionate to us. And there's marvelous passages dealing with our middle condition between nothing and infinity, in relation to the infinite we are nothing, in relation to nothing, we are infinite. And where can we find a measure in that? It's a very equivocal between metaxou in Pascal's way of thinking. But he wants to make us feel perplexed in a manner that allows us to acknowledge something of our lostness in the universe. But it's a lostness that for him is also informed by something like a homing instinct. It isn't absolute lostness, because if it was absolute lostness, we wouldn't even know that we were lost. There's something about our being that I'm calling it a homing instinct. And I think that has also something to do with what measure might be in remaining true to what we are, but in remaining true to what we are, we're also called to be true to what is other to what we are. That being true to ourselves is not, again, just a self-referential curving back to self, but in its self-transcendence, actually. The self-transcendence is as much in the dimension of intimacy as in the dimension of exteriority. It's interesting that there's a dialectical side to Pascal, just at least worth mentioning here. He tends to think there's a strongly skeptical side, but it's skepticism that is directed in a spiritual manner towards acknowledging something like our lostness, but in the very acknowledgement of lostness, recovering something of a direction that points in a more homing manner. But he does say something like that when you're searching for truth, to find the true middle point, you sometimes have to go to one extreme. But having gone to one extreme, you also then have to go to the other extreme. So there's a kind of a strange betweening. It's not just that we're in between infinity and nothing, but we as thinkers are driven to extremes by, again, you can call it the skeptical principle, you can call it perplexity in the sense that I've tried to indicate there earlier, but we're creatures of extremities, whether in the dimension of the infinitesimal or whether in the dimension of the infinite. And we somehow have to be true to the extremes and find some place in the middle where the extremes communicate with each other and cross. It's a kind of dialectic that is quite different to the Hegelian dialectic, for instance. It's a dialectic that is also, in a strange way, quite different to the Socratic, Platonic dialectic, because it's accentuated by something like a Augustinian intensiveness of subjectivity or of the soul. It's not just a rational evaluation of opposites and then a judicious and sober judgment in the middle. There's an existential, ontological and theological side to being stressed between these extremities. And where is the measure in all of that? Pascal himself says, none of us is the measure of it. There's a famous passage that I'd like to quote where he says, no one comprehends them, only the author of these mysteries can comprehend them. So that it's implicitly, it's not merely implicitly, but it's a reference to a divine measure alone is adequate to these perplexities. So 20 past 5 or so. Again, just to come back to that those three trenches of, I just want to draw attention to three kinds of disproportion in relation to creation, for instance. This again, that first sense of transcendence that I mentioned at the beginning, nature as other. And again, I think the project of modernity is actually to diminish that sense of otherness in nature and make it subject to our self-determination. But it's interesting to think of the ecological crisis at the moment as the kind of pushback, so to say, that the conditions of nature allow us to be the kinds of beings that we are, allow us perhaps even to be the measure of the very conditions that allow us to be the kinds of beings that we are. But when we measure nature in a certain way, we are not true to nature itself as a naturing, that there's something at work in the very otherness of nature that exceeds our measure. And that excess comes to manifestation at the limit of our own mastery of what has presented itself as other to us. Think again of an ominous question to be raised about the extremities of technology as they go to certain boundaries, and the fact that certainly in recent centuries, developments in technologies that are helpful to human beings are often inseparable from the development of more and more effective weapons of killing. Death and life seem to be intertwined with each other in this project. Again, raising a perplexity about us claiming to be the measure of what's at play, because you could make the case that precisely in us claiming to be the measure, we have lost our ability to measure what is of greatest moment. But I think that one thing, I just name it, the sense of the sublime, for instance. The sense of the sublime in the postmodern time, just back in the 80s and 90s, most of the postmoderns were interested in Kant, but they weren't really interested in the sublime in relation to nature as other. They were often more interested in the so-called postmodern sublime, which would have to do with massive architectural constructions, skyscrapers and things like that. But in a certain sense, the interest in human buildings is, again, a mirror game where in the sublimity of the construction, we see something of our own sublimity reflected back to us. We go into the great city, but all of the buildings are mirror images of ourselves. So we actually, strangely, in the otherness, short circuit a confrontation with otherness that somersaults us outside of ourselves. In a certain sense, we're denatured in that sublimity, whereas I think I would rehabilitate something of the secret religious impulse of the Romantic generation in trying to find a sense of the sacred in the sublimity of nature over against the lifeless mechanism of deism on the one hand or Newtonian science on the other. Now again, that's not the end of a search for a sense of sacred otherness, but if I'm not mistaken, the way the ecological theme has taken hold of people, it's a measure really of a malnourishment on our part for that sense of we are homing creatures relative to nature that has natured us. Now again, I don't think nature and naturing is to be identified with divinity, but there's something about the cosmos itself that has it's home, and we're not at home at one and the same time. But simply by constructing our houses and buildings in certain ways, that doesn't necessarily make us at home on the earth. And again, I don't think I'm mistaken that underneath the surface of things, these restlessnesses and perplexities are stirring for many people. The human being and disproportion, again, we can come back to somebody like Pascal just as an illustration, where he talks about the wretchedness of the human being as well as the grandeur of the human being, that doubleness has to be asserted, that there's something immeasurably great about the human being, and yet the very immeasurable greatness can produce the worst of the worst in relation to the, let's call it, the innocence of nature. So there's something monstrous about the human being, but monstrosity itself is a sacred category. The monster, those of us who are Catholics, we knew from the old days when the host was shown in the monstrance. Monstrance literally means a place of showing. So the monstrous shows something in excess of our measure. And even our monstrosity has something of a sacred character to it, even if inverted away from the monstrousness. I mean, the most monstrous of all sacred happenings, in a certain sense, is the cross. So disproportion, the sense of divine disproportion, that's the question, in one sense, how to go about it. In the remaining time, I know I've gone on, but I want to leave some time for questions, if there are questions. Let me just try and say a few things about dialectic analogy. Again, these are more philosophically used by me here at the moment, but certainly many of you will be aware of the doctrine of analogy. And if you're students of philosophy, the notion of dialectic is something that has different practices. I think the Hegelian view of dialectic is very different in the end to the Socratic, Platonic practice of dialectic. I think the latter is much more open to the sense of what exceeds human measure, whereas I see Hegel's dialectic as a self-mediating dialectic. So the difference of disproportion is itself reconfigured as something proportionate to the power of reason itself to comprehend what at least it initially exceeds it, but if it puts itself to work, it overreaches that excess and takes it to itself. So you have a very powerful modality of thinking, but its relationship to what is other, to thought, is always as a mediating other that is to be returned to the process of self-mediating thinking. There's a logic of self-determination deeply embedded in Hegel's dialectical way of thinking. And the question would be, relative to the remarks here, whether that is actually adequate to the sense of excess, transcendence, and disproportion that certain traditions of speculative theology, certain religious traditions, deem to be essential to the definition of the understanding of God. Analogy and dialectic. Analogy is very interesting, and there is an analogy of proportionality, proper proportionality, and one of the roots of the doctrine of analogy, of course, is in mathematical ratio. And I think it's worth reflecting on. A mathematical ratio is itself shaped by, again, a measure of determinability. You know, 2:4 as 4:8. You can make up your proportions there, but there is a kind of precision in certain forms of proportionality. So where does disproportion fit in? I think in the classical doctrine of analogy, the fact that, again, in the Lateran Council, it was said that the dissimilitude was always greater than the similitude. I think that the analogy has to be dynamized. And again, relative to my own work, I've been asked by more than one, why don't I spend more time talking about analogy? And one of the reasons is that I think that analogy itself has to be dynamized. The terms in relation can't just be seen as static determinations that can be put on a quasi-mathematical grid, and we feel ourselves the measure of the proper proportionality. And one of the powers of dialectic, certainly in Hegel's hands, is that it tries to be true to the self-transcending process of thinking itself, that it's a dynamic moving between the extremes of finitude and infinity. But I think that analogy is also capable of being looked at in the metaxological terms that I try to develop as a betweening, that it's a play between likeness and unlikeness. Metaphor is dynamic in the same way. The word metaphor, as coming from metaphorein, carries that ferrying between, perhaps even ferrying above. I talk about symbols. We mentioned symbols in relation to Cusa also. The symbalein, the throwing together, that notion of being thrown, not us throwing, but being thrown into a togetherness of sometimes divided terms. But the ana in analogon is, of course, a swiveling term. It's a pointing back, and it's also a pointing forward. Again, some of you are perhaps better experts on the inner scholarship of analogizing, but that play back and forth between likeness and unlikeness is itself highly dynamic. And again, it brings us back to that sense of measuring that can't be reduced to a determinate measure. You have to enter into the play of likening and unlikening. And the fact that unlikeness, dissimilitude, is said always to be greater than similitude, I think is obviously of absolute significance in trying to name the superlative excess of divinity, of God. The strange irreducibility that, in fact, is never known by us except in this in-between. I mean, the notion of incarnation itself could be viewed as a divine betweening between God and creatures. But again, you have this dynamized sense of a between, which I think is possible to see in a certain reformulation of analogy, but the sense of disproportion always remains. So with that sense of disproportion, I think we come back again to the sense of mystery and measure, that if there is disproportion that is constitutive at the most intimate ontological level, that is constitutive also at the if you like, highest theological level of being and relation, the whole notion of measure calls out for significant rethinking. I have more, but I think I'll just shut up.
For the wide and deep talk that you just gave to us. I wanted to collect two parts of it to make a comment / question. So I was very struck by the idea that wonder has to have determination, because to me it seems that it's a two-step process. One first of indeterminacy that then receives determination. And by this I look back at something like aporia in the Platonic dialogues, which aporia we can take it as not having ways out, but also as not having riches. And one of those ways of interpreting not having riches is not having richness in opinions, not being resourceful in opinions. So, for example, if you take Nino, when he keeps on giving definitions of virtue, but they're wrong, eventually when he gets angry at Socrates, it's because he has reached this state where he doesn't have any more opinions. And only then in this sort of moments is where you don't have these opinions blocking your way, where you can start to look for the right determination. And now this leads me to my second comment, from where I hope the question will arise, which is about Gulliver's Travels.
Gulliver's Travels.
The Lilliputians and the giants, their name's complicated for me to say, so.
Brobdingnag.
It seems what Gulliver is, or what Swift is detecting there, is not only the size, but it is pusillanimous, small soulness and great soulness in both of them. And at first, and as you pointed out, it seems that Gulliver has some semblances throughout the book with the Lilliputians, right? When he's talking about empire, and eventually he recognizes himself as a Yahoo, and he wants to get away from that, right? To become like a horse.
Yeah.
And so the question is here: what is the role of the soul in the measuring? And within that, how do we go from all of these opinions that turn us small, these opinions that turn us big?
Yeah, I mean, they open up lots of avenues. Your comment and your question. Just to come back to the aporia, the way you pose the question and looking at the Meno, it's teleologically oriented. It's not archaeologically. And I would look at the erotics of knowing. There's an eros of knowing. And in a certain sense, Socrates is drawing forth the erotics of the slave. There's something more than just lack in the slave, in that interplay. And I think it's very interesting that in the genealogy of Eros in the Symposium, Socrates and Diotima's version of it, Eros is born out of Penia and Poros. So the notion of Poros is at the very conception of Eros itself. However you translate Poros, resource, it's sometimes translated Poros, I think is also related to porosity, the aporia, you can't find a way forward. It has that sense of an open way that isn't quite determinable as a way. But the myth of the conception of Eros is fascinating because Poros is with the gods feasting. They're drinking nectar, I presume, or maybe it is Westmalle triple. It doesn't give any details in that particular score. And Penia somehow manages to couple, the details aren't given of that act of copulation, so to say, sacred copulation. But Poros staggers from the feast of the gods drunk, and Penia, sharp and shrewd and wily, gets pregnant, etc. But there's the sleeping festivity of the gods at the very roots of Eros itself. And I take that to be an image of a fullness, even though it's sleeping. In us, for instance, when Eros awakens, it's not just merely a lack, it's an energy that finds itself expressed as lacking its beloved, but the energy that moves it has something of divine intoxication to it. So, I mean, it would be a question for Socrates as to whether he is too teleologically oriented rather than archaeologically oriented in, as it were, psychoanalyzing the depths of the soul that come out of its community with the gods, so to say. I mean, I think the doctrine of anamnesis, that's often dismissed, but I see it as a mythological doctrine, if you like, but it's trying to get at, there's a constitutive richness already at work in the human being, even when we experience the most extreme form of lack in an erotic longing and an erotic wanting. And I don't think throughout the tradition of philosophy, we have been always teleologically oriented. We haven't done justice to that more original porosity out of which the desire itself comes. So that's to be thought of further. But the second thing about Gulliver, that last visit to the land of the Houyhnhnms it's a savage attack on a kind of utopian rationalism, because I mean some people see in the talking horses the image of a perfected humanity. You know, they're not moved by emotion, they have these councils together and so on, and they're fully rational. They don't know the thing that is not, they don't know what untruth is, because no one tells lies or anything. But if you read it more closely, you'll see that actually the horses have a council at one particular point where they're in the business of deliberating whether the yahoos are to be exterminated from the surface of the earth. So these hyper-rational creatures are in a, we've seen that kind of nihilation project at work in our own time. So I think that Swift had a dark vision, really, of human beings. He said, I hate humanity, but I love Tom and Dick and Harry. The sense of the particularity and singularity of human beings. Now that's another question. But when Gulliver comes home, then those scenes at the end where he smells his wife and children, and well, he's ashamed when he realizes that he's not, like when he's exposed as a human being, just like the yahoos. I'm just like one of the yahoos. But when he comes home, first he can only sleep in the barn with his horses. He feels at home with his horses. The smell of human beings is repugnant to him. And when he eventually goes back into the house, as you know, he's able to sit with his wife as long as the table is long enough. And slowly he begins to be acclimatized to the smell of human beings. Now, it's all told in a deadpan tone by Swift, but some people have seen in Swift a misanthropy, a hatred of human beings. And I think he probably was tempted by that, but the sense of the absurdity somehow saved him from madness. The fact that it's black humor. The black humor saved him from a darker blackness. I don't think I'm answering your question, but reformulate it if you want to. But I just, there's so much philosophical thought, depth of possible philosophical challenge in some of the things that are in Gulliver's Travels. An extraordinary book, absolutely singular. Go ahead, please.
Well, no, just a small comment. It's going in October. It's going to be 350 years since it was written.
350 years, yeah. Yeah, there's great stuff there about projects. I mean, I have a kind of a bee in my bonnet about projects. But I mean, Swift already, this is the Royal Society in London, all these projects that they have, and some of them were actually described in the book itself. Tried to build houses from the top down, tried to reverse the process of nutrition so that the excrement is turned back into food. There's a beautiful one for students, that one where they write mathematical formula on a particular kind of wafer, and the students are supposed to eat the wafer. It's a materialistic kind of view of thoughts. If you eat the wafer with the formula, slowly the wafer will work through the physical system and eventually will reach the brain, and you'll be mathematically. I mean, this is like a chip in the brain almost, except you have to eat it. But Swift says, the students were very recalcitrant, so whenever they could, they'd sneak outside and disgorge the bolus. To puke it all up again. They didn't want to be taught mathematics by this materialistic. So there's a great one too in it for the abolition of words. Why do we need words? If words stand for things, why aren't things enough? So why can't we have a conversation by showing each other the things? It's a send-up of analytic philosophy, actually, 200 years early. So you have these people going around with things, and instead of talking, because they're saving their breath, they show each other the things. If I came in and gave a lecture showing the things, and he then says, of course, the ordinary folk and the women refused to go along with these projects. They wanted to speak in the way of their fathers. Such are the enemies of science among the women and the ordinary people. So it's a kind of it's a kind of a put down, but it's an absolute genius, work of genius.
Okay, next question, Father Robert.
Professor, I'm wondering if we could speak a little bit about the relationship between mystery and personal fear. And I'm thinking of that in terms of Gabriel Marcel's paradigm between problem and mystery. And when I think about something like love, maybe on the positive side, or evil or death on the negative side, I'm implicated in that which I'm
exactly.
I can't, arrive at a final solution, and I probably can't call a technician to kind of fix it for me. I'm just wondering any thoughts you have on that.
Yeah, the distinction between problem and mystery is a kind of a brother or a sister to things that I'm saying about determinability and over-determination. But as you know, I mean, Marcel is very perceptive at the beginning, really, in the 1920s, 30s, seeing that we're living in a world that's dominated by the notion of a problem. And a problem, if it is properly formulated, always anticipates its solution. So, whereas a mystery, so you can objectivize it, you can be detached from a problem and its solution. Whereas that's not the case in a mystery. You're implicated. In fact, we ourselves are mysteries, not only to ourselves, but even in a deeper ontological sense. So we can't stand outside, we can't stand at a distance. We can't make them determinable in that kind of exactitude that allows us off the hook, so to say. But I think that one of the places where he learned that this was so important was during the First World War. I think I mentioned this in the session of Techmeyer's Philosophy of God. His function was to tell the relatives of sons who had died, that they had died in the war and so on. And the image is something like this. He could have treated it as a problem where there's information. John Doe has died on such and such a date in Verdun or whatever, and pass the information on to the family so that you have a transaction of information and the problem is solved, so to say. But he, in fact, found in going to the people themselves and telling the story, the kind of the saturated human implication, not only of the grieving family, but of the teller of this. It's not information, it's entry into the mystery of mortality and grief, in which he also is drawn into it. So that was very significant in seeing there's an irreducibility about that comportment towards a question, a perplexity, a grief that can't be handled in a merely problematic way. And it's by going through that door, so to say, that threshold, painful as it is, that a deeper sense of the mystery of being, of not only human being, but the mystery of being as such, came more and more into his way of trying to think about things. I think that experience was also very significant in his own conversion to Catholicism, because there was a hyper-problematic dimension to reality itself, and we ourselves are intimately involved with it. And that sense of intimacy, that intimacy of being, is something that is either kind of we're fugitive from it, or we flatten it down in the kind of univocal homogenizing that follows from a technological or cybernetic paradigm of what it means to be.
Thank you. Next question.
Perhaps the question will unfold as I frame it, but I was sort of attempting to reconstruct how you relate these different senses of determination and the different senses of being, right? So perhaps you could approach it from one of two directions. Let's say, so I'll start with the overdetermined, which I think correlates with the metaxological. There's the interdetermined as the dialectical. The indeterminate as the equivocal, perhaps, and then the determined as the univocal, as the precise. Is that how you do?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to I mean, when I was thinking about what it means to be determinate, and if you look at the tradition of philosophy, being determinate is very much bound up with what it means to be at all and what it means to be intelligible. And the question then is, what makes determinacy intelligible? But my response was that things are not just simply determinate. There's a determining process in our search for the determinate. But things themselves, so far as they come to be and become, they're also not just mere determinations, but outcomes of determinings. So how think of a determining? And one of the standard answers throughout the tradition is that you have this couplet of the indeterminate and the determinate. I didn't think that was enough to actually do justice to what's at stake, because there must be something about the so-called indeterminate that already is endowed with the promise of a coming to be determinate. So there's more. There's two ways of looking at the indeterminate, either in the entirely lacking sense, as is often the case throughout the philosophical tradition, or as seeing it in this more positive sense of a fullness exceeding finite determination that allows finite determinations to be or come to be. So, but it gets complicated then when you bring in the idea of self-determining, and I think that very much comes to the fore in modernity, insofar as we have understood the process of intelligibility as us making intelligibilities. But in terms of the correlation with the fourfold, I think the over-determinacy actually is the between in one sense, as the field of a too muchness out of which determinacies come to manifestation. But these determinacies themselves they're not actually absolutely univocal. There's an equivocity in the sense of a play of likeness and unlikeness. What I call the dialectic is a way of trying to mediate between the univocal and the equivocal in that sense. So it's not just indeterminacy, it's not just determination. Especially in the Hegelian case, it becomes a process of self-determination. But I think that is not actually true to a dialectical process as a betweening between possibilities. It tilts the mediation to the side of our part, of the power of the self to mediate the in-between space. And what I call the metaxological in a more express sense is an acknowledgement that there are over-determinacies in our ontological situation that exceed the terms of self-mediation and exceed dialectic in that sense. But again, that's not simply a rejection of dialectic. When you recognize that there are plural practices of dialectic, you can see in something like the Platonic dialectic an openness to an otherness that can't be contained in a self-mediating dialectic. You can see in dialectic a way of treating skeptically of equivocities also. Metaxology opens up dialectic to possibilities that, for instance, certainly in the modern age, due to the towering influence of Hegel, have been systematically closed off. And the self-referring aspect of our unfolding and that self-referring is not just only at an individual level, it can be humanity as a whole, thinking the very process of history simply refers to us as the masters and possessors of nature, but it's also the masters and possessor in a transhumanist sense of history, a theme that's very much, I think, returning to the surface of our own current world at the moment.
If I could extend that a bit. So in my understanding, there's a way in which the other three are kind of hierarchically nested within the metaxological. That's the higher vantage of the relation between them. And there's a way in which, that's why the archaeology is necessary, right? Yeah. To unveil the way in which the determinate is kind of rooted in the indeterminate and the interdetermination of the two within the overdetermination. And that the hunt for precision, as it were, is a passage through that. And it's the archaeology that unveils the relation.
Right.
But if that's correct, is there a way in which determination itself, in its precision, unveils it loops back upon the kind of surface?
I'm not rejecting determinacy. I'm giving an archaeology of determinacy, such that the fixation on something like a static determinacy is untrue to what is determinate. That something is at play in the determinate that exceeds that static determinacy, and it opens up in its own, so to say, ontological roots, and opens beyond itself to something more than, again, just fixed determinacies. So it's not playing one off against the other. It's dwelling if we dwell with what shows itself with this intricacy of determinacy, we begin to slowly enter into the depth of a mystery. You know, I mean, again, I think some great poets, and just the figure of Manly Hopkins comes to mind here. The way and he was very much influenced by Scotus in the kind of hekaitas, the hexitas of things, the thisness. That the thisness itself is it's a face of something that is infinitely rich. It's not just a flat face and there's nothing, as it were, beyond its surface. There's a famous line in one of the poems where he says, but the nature is never spent, but he says, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. It's a beautiful poem. The dearest freshness deep down things, but that's all beings that have come to be. But we don't see it. We live on the surface in an unattending way, so to say. And someone like Hopkins as a poet reminds us of this, even when, generations have trod, because the first part of that sonnet is a picture of human beings, bleared and smeared and stained with toil and so on. It's a very bleak picture of what human beings have done to the face of creation, and yet there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And I would see a metaxology as trying to reconnect in thought and in image and in poetry with this enabling deep down freshness and things. That's what I have to say.
Right.
A small question. You mentioned in between, we were speaking about Pascal's view of lostness, but that shows that, but our awareness of the fact that we're lost shows that we have this sort of homing instinct. I'm wondering what you would view home to be then, insofar as, and you'd also mentioned that a building doesn't make a home, obviously, it makes a house, but not per se a home.
No.
So what would then home be?
Well, that's a big question. I just wrote a book called Wayward and Homebound. So you should get a copy of it. You should all get a copy of it. It's a little bit like the question of measure that you were talking about today. You can't say it's this, though there are particularities for each human being, I think, where, and I know that there are people who are not blessed with emerging from a place where they have had a sense of home. And it could be said that maybe the conditions of life that are being created on the globe at the moment diminish the possibility of at least emerging from a home into a sojourn and a pilgrimage into strangeness and otherness. But I do think there's something to be said then for what we carry with us. And I don't think you can generalize on this particular score, but there is the homing of each. I do believe that each of us is a kind of, if you need to use the language of pilgrim, the pilgrim is away from home in search of a home elsewhere, but in being on pilgrim, there's a strange being at home and not being at home, that we ourselves are carriers. I think outside of a theological vision, I don't see how this actually can make any sense. If we're just roaming the world as tabula rasa, I don't think that we're tabula rasa. If I could put it in a kind of biblical terms, when we talk about being in the image and likeness of God, there's something about being in the image that is home, and there's a certain sense in which the image is not effaceable. It's the ineffaceable image is the shine of the face of the Father on us. It's ineffaceable, but the likeness is not exactly the same as the image, because the likeness is in interplay with unlikeness. So we can become ourselves in both likeness and unlikeness, and we can create unlikenesses that, as it were, they create films between us and the image. And so, I mean, this could be taken in many different directions, but as we roam in the sphere of unlikeness, we're always in a kind of oscillation with likeness, and that oscillation is not unanchored absolutely from the image. The image has something to do with the homing instinct that calls us back to likeness in a truer sense. Does that make any sense to you? Yeah. I find it very perplexing, but it means you can't objectify home, though again human beings as incarnate and coming from place have homes. If they're blessed, there are people who are not blessed from the outset with, for instance, the pietas of home is so diminished in our times, whereas that sense of home in filial piety, familial piety, the piety of place, where piety again is a special reverence, a special loyalty, that has been eviscerated really by many of the dominant ideologies that have overspilt the Western world as mere kind of feeding ground for fascisms and so on, you know. I think there's something deeper at stake there than just that. Though again, the seeds of the earth can bring forth monsters as much as flowers. So you're this equivocal interplay between likeness and unlikeness. The monstrous as the showing of the divine, and the monstrous as the refusal of the divine, as it were, and the creation of a counterfeit double of God. But I think probably the homelessness, if there is a future and we can't always find the place of home, this other sense of home is, in one sense, it's a borderless home. You know, Novalis says somewhere that to philosophize is to be at home everywhere. And the question is, can you be at home everywhere? Must you not have somewhere to be at home? But there's something about Catholicity also that is, in one sense, borderless. There's no boundary. But we can't live without boundaries, given our mortal character. So that deep longing for a home on earth is in tension with the sense of home. I mean, this is very standard throughout the longer tradition, that there is a sense of exile to being, which we don't talk about at all now. That we're in one sense, the earth is our home, but we are not fully at home where we are at home. That tension between being at home and not being at home, and trying to be at home and not being at home, and then even not being at home in being at home. If you ever leave your hometown and go back, sometimes you say, I'm going home, but when you go home, you sometimes find, I'm not at home in being at home. This kind of double condition, and I wonder to what extent it's becoming more generalized in the world of migrancy. That, I mean, one way that I just, there was a conference in Rome there a couple of years ago on boundaries, and the question that I was putting was something like this: do we need Hestia as much as Hermes? Hestia is the virgin goddess of home, and Hermes is a god of betweening, a god that turns more to what is beyond and moves in between, of migrancy and so on. But Hestia was a virgin goddess, and that would seem to be, she minds the hearth, keeps the fire alive, but we tend to think then a virgin is sterile. But in fact, without the fire being kept alive, there is no family. There is no generativity. So there's a strange, again, doubleness of the virgin goddess and the perpetuation of the family. And again, in the ancient world, when the colonies from, say, Greece came to Italy and that sort of thing, the fire would be brought from the home. Again, Hestia would be honoured. And I think we live in a time when Hestia is not honoured. And Hermes needs Hestia as much as Hestia needs Hermes.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end if we could give a final round of applause.